Good afternoon, morning, evening, night, or whenever you're watching this. My name is Clyde Kelly. I'm a student in History 101. I'm coming to you today from the Windy City. That's right, the Garden State, Florida, USA. And today we'll be learning about the Battle of Tours. Actually, I should explain the Florida thing. I'm down in Florida right now, just on vacation. I'm recording this in a hotel room, trying to make the best of things. Today we're learning about the Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers, or the Battle of the Road of Martyrs, which the Muslims called that, or something like that. But Tours is easier to say, so we're going to stick with that all the way through. We'll learn the who, what, where, why, and whens of this event through that particular sort of format, though not specifically in that order. We'll also go into how this affects us today, and why this particular historical event is so important for the way that all of history proceeds afterwards. So, if you all have your notepads or similar note-taking device, maybe a phone or a tape recorder, some popcorn, and a bit of patience, or possibly a lot of patience, depending on the kind of person you are, we'll dive right into this lesson. Also, I'm going to ask you an important question regarding the material at the end of this little talk, so pay attention. Alright, we're going to get into the who here on slide 2. The battle is part of a larger, longer, ongoing war waged between the expanding Muslim empire and the Christian powers to the north. The Muslims were invading northward while the Christians in Gaul attempted to hold on to what they had. Abdul Rahman was the leader in this particular battle on the Muslim front, and the Franks were headed by Charles the Hammer Martel, although actually I found out that Martel actually means the hammer, so we're saying Charles the Hammer. So we'll just say Charles Martel. And that's a cool name, the Hammer. I kind of wish people called me Clyde the Hammer. That'd be pretty cool. Anyway, a little background on these guys is necessary to understand why they were fighting, what they were doing beforehand, and what they did afterward. So here we have Charles Martel. Alright. Yeah, here we have Charles Martel. Charles was the illegitimate son of Pepin, who was a man with a much less cool name, Pepin, really, but a pretty cool title, ruler of the Franks. Pepin had no legitimate sons. I guess he had one, but he was assassinated. And being illegitimate back then, hold on here a second. Sorry about that, got interrupted back there. Anyway, being illegitimate back then, Charles was, that was a really big deal, and not in a good way. Most of the time, an illegitimate son was cut out of the family inheritance, or just plain old disowned. Sure, the illegitimate child didn't actually do anything wrong themselves, but that didn't really seem to matter. Anyway, Pepin still did have a grandson who was legitimate. He did have a claim to the throne. But Charles proceeded to beat this guy out of the throne. That happened around 714 AD. I would like to think that Charles beat this guy out of the throne using a hammer, but we don't actually know how he did it, though it probably involved something to do with his stepmother, just from what I read. But the details are fuzzy. Anyway, after beating this rival, this younger guy, to the throne, Charles Martel then governed the Franks. He was the man in charge, the head honcho. Alright, proceeding on here, the Franks, just so you know, they were a Germanic people. They were very much so Romanized, meaning they had adopted a good deal of Roman culture over the years. They just kind of moved into them culturally. They occupied the area of Western Germany, Northern France, and Belgium. They adopted Christianity at some point in the 400s somehow, and just stuck with that religion primarily as their state, not really state, I guess their state religion. During the time of the Muslim invasion, of which we are learning about now, there was a lot of internal quarreling and infighting as a result of the messy transition of power from Pepin II to Charles Martel, which I know I just told you about, so I'm not going to go into it here. Duke Odo of Aquitaine had taken the opportunity to declare his independence from the Frankish kingdom sometime around the time of the messy transition. So Charles was not happy with him about that. This led to a lot more fighting and internal strife that served to weaken the Franks, just prior to the southern invasion. Really inconvenient for the Franks, but super good timing for an incursion. So here we have a picture of a typical Frankish soldier. On slide 5 here, note the overall lack of armor. In real life, it's likely that most of the Franks lacked any armor. They weren't wearing a whole lot. Instead, they were clothed in various furs and cloths. These furs, jackets, and warm winter clothes would actually turn out to be a deciding factor in the battle, which we shall soon discuss. They would have been armed with, swords and battle axes and stuff like that. And there's a couple of really good paintings of Charles Martel with a battle axe. This opposed to the Arab, Muslim, and the Berber infantry, cavalry, and all those guys who they were to come up against. So here we have on slide 6, okay? Now on the other side of the battlefield, we had the invading Muslim army, led by Abd ar-Rahman. I'm going to call him Abdul. That's another name I read he was called. It was actually really weird. I read about him having a couple different, I don't know, different websites and different sources I had called this guy different names. So we're going to call him Abdul Rahman. That seems to be the most pronunciable name of his. And he was under the Umayyad Caliphate. He was heading a force of somewhere around 25,000 men, probably upwards of there, most likely more, most of them mounted cavalry. These guys had a very different style of dress than the Gauls and Franks. Being accustomed to fighting in the deserts and warmer climates of North Africa, they wore mostly metal armor, like chain mail. The territory they were invading now was very different than anything they had experienced fighting in, so you can not really blame them for not dressing for the occasion. Being as the time of year when the battle happened was late October, the weather was starting to get a bit colder, and the snow was starting to fly. The devil's dandruff, as I like to call it. But anyway, this lack of warm clothing, it ended up playing a major role in the battle ahead. But back to the movements of the Muslim forces. They'd been pushing up from the south and were, hell-bent on taking the rest of Europe by going up through France and southern Gaul. Had they done so, history and the future would look very different. So here's a picture of Abdul Rahman, or at least what we think he looked like. And here's a picture of the typical Muslim soldier from that time period. Alright, moving on now to slide 7. So even with all that we know about this battle, we still have not discovered its exact location, which it annoys me slightly. I kind of wish we had something that said, hey, here's where that happened, but we don't. Our best guess is that it happened somewhere between the towns of Tours, Poitiers, and between the rivers of Claine and Vienne. And the Christians were up on a hill. But we'll talk about that later. That is very applicable to the situation. The towns, of course, are where the battle gets its two names, by which it is called. Muslims called it the Battle of the Highway of Martyrs, though, so they took it a whole nother direction than just naming it based on where it was, which I kind of like, a little more creative there. And to be honest, one of the more astounding things is that they have somehow been unable to find the place this battle was fought. They know the towns and everything, they know where the rivers were, it was on a hill, but they still haven't found it. So all we have is a general idea, and people have drawn out maps of what they think it looked like. So now we have sides, we have a date, we know when this happened, 732 AD, okay? And we kind of, but not really, have a location, which, as I said, frustrates me. I like to have the details of something like this. So now we'll start getting into more minute detail as to what happened before the battle, what happened during the battle, what the aftershocks were, and how they affect us all today. Slide 9. The Battle of Tours was prefaced by northward Islamic advance. If we go back farther, however, we see the northward Islamic conquest beginning almost directly after the death of Muhammad, Muhammad the Prophet, in 632 AD. And culminating in the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, which is a whole 100 years later, right on the nose. You may be saying to yourself, wow, it sure took a while for those guys to get up from Africa through Spain and into France and Gaul. Well, all I have to say to you is that conquering a couple nations is not as easy as it looks. Plus, a lot of that time used has a lot to do with the Muslim style of fighting, conquering and progressing forward while living off the resources of the surrounding territory. I think it is important to look at the Muslim conquest as not entirely negative, though. Especially in Spain, there were some positive things that came with the Muslim occupation. These positive additions included libraries, public baths, I don't even want to bathe in public, colleges, and all sorts of good things. Things were not always so hot for the occupied people, which can be expected. Non-Muslims, mostly Jews and Christians, were regarded as sort of second-class citizens, though they were not barred from any particular profession or trade. They seemed to fare much better than most Christians and Jews do in Muslim-occupied areas. Even today, really, they did not receive the worst treatment there. So anyway, moving on to slide 10. The whole of the conquest was a pretty fast stop-and-go game over the course of the century, 632 to 732 AD, which is why it took so long. As the Muslim army took a pause, they'd refresh and gather more troops from the recently conquered region, and over a period of time strengthen their forces so that they could just burst forward quickly again and take another country or large sect of land. One of the most important forces that they acquired while stopping somewhere in, I think it was sub-Saharan Africa, was the Berbers. The Berbers, or as the Berbers like to call themselves, and I'm going to try to get this one right here, the Imazighen, 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 meaning men of the land, joined the Muslim forces somewhere around 711 AD. They aided the Muslims in the conquering of Spain and stuck around for a good time afterward. Moving on to this is slide 12 now. Sorry, I was counting them wrong there. So anyway, fast moving is probably the best way to describe the strategy used by the Islamic forces. Speed was the name of the game with these guys. They didn't bother with siege weapons or anything that could necessarily slow them down. They conquered on horseback and then lived off the resources around them from the areas that they just conquered. It kind of reminds you of what Genghis Khan did, move fast and live off resources. So anyway, this method of living off the land let them move fast without the hindrance of carrying lots of gear and supplies for themselves. So moving on to slide 13 here. There was a hard push of conquering directly after the death of Muhammad, and a little pause for a bit, and then a resurgence that resulted in the taking of Egypt and North Africa. The conquering paused again, and then resumed with the taking of Spain. Conquering then rested and continued in such a manner for about a century, all the way leading up to the Battle of Tours. I think you're getting the point here. It was really a stop, rest. Go, stop, rest. It was a real stop and go, but it worked. So don't ding it. It worked. Slide 14. The invading army easily took over southern Gaul by the year 719, so they're moving fast. The conquest was temporarily inconvenienced by an ambush near Toulouse, led by the Duke Odo of Aquitaine, and he's seen in this picture here. He was only really able to claim victory by the use of the element of surprise, and by the fact that his enemy really did just not see him coming. It was really just surprise. For what we can tell, the Muslim army, they weren't very well equipped at the time he attacked them, so even though he had lesser numbers from what we know, he had a bit of an advantage in that one. Moving on to slide 15. In another push, the invaders sacked the city of Bordeaux. So Odo, he's the guy we talked about in the last slide, once again tried to fend off the opposing forces, but was brutally defeated this time around. He did not have the advantage of surprise this time and was largely outnumbered, and the Muslim forces were better equipped than they were previously. So in this battle, the Battle of Garonne River, Odo's forces were all but obliterated by the Muslim cavalry. And the Muslim cavalry was very much known for their obliteration. They were known for their cavalry. That's one thing. So from what we can tell, this is slide 16 now, one of the leading motivations for the Muslim army was the collection of booty. It'd be treasure. With the way that this Muslim army worked, smaller, faster raiding parties would go out first and get all the treasure, riches, and booty they could find and wait for the slower moving parts of the war machine, because there were some slower parts, to catch up. As we can see from the amount of land their army conquered, that strategy worked fine for them and seemed like it would work for the foreseeable future. The apparent motivation to take Tours was the treasure at the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours. Like a fly to a bug light, they went in that direction. There's gold there, so if they want gold, that's where they'd go. So on slide 17 here we can see a picture of the Abbey of St. Martin. It's about 150 miles southwest of Paris, France. The monastery was founded in 372, and the building is still around today. The Abbey is a great example of Gothic architecture. I mean, I've got a picture up there for you to look at, but there's some more pictures you can find online. It's really just beautiful. You know, it has all the stained glass, the pointed arches, really ornate stone decorations like gargoyle kind of stuff, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, which are all things that, I mean, I think we read about that a couple chapters ago in history. All things that are characteristic of the Gothic style. So now back to Odo. This is slide 18 here. Odo gathered his remaining men together, and there were not many of them, and they hightailed it north to try and get help. He found help in the form of an old adversary, Charles Martel. Now, you really get a sense of how desperate the situation was just from the fact that Odo, this old guy, probably pretty proud, humbled himself enough to go to Charles for help. So when I say these guys, Charles and Odo, were adversaries or rivals, it's almost a bit of an understatement. Despite their shared religion of Christianity, Charles Martel and Duke Odo had been fighting each other viciously for quite a while. Over, the Duke of Odo always wanted to declare his independence and get away from them, and Charles was like, no, we got to keep together, and all that stuff. So, anyway, slide 19. As the Muslim forces made haste towards Tours, that's a good one, Charles Martel was gathering men together. He was able to get together, as previously mentioned, I think I mentioned it somewhere between 15,000 to 30,000 men. Honestly, there are very few numbers on this. One number I found was that he got together 15,000 to 75,000 men, and the Muslims said something like 100,000 to 200,000, which that's a little bit out of the reasonable ballpark, so we're going to go with he had about 15,000, maybe 20,000 at the tops, okay? He got together about 20,000 seasoned troops. We do not know for sure what the number was. They began working their way southward, towards where they presumed the Muslim army would be. All of this was done with extreme caution, with utmost concern for stealth. The invading force was much larger than the defending, so the only thing on their side was the advantage of surprise. The same thing that Odo had. And that one battle he won. So, slide 20 here. The previously fast-moving army of Ar-Rahman, Abdul-Rahman, Ar-Rahman was another name I found, was moving much slower than it had been. Most of the troops were split up into raiding parties for the purpose of ransacking and pillaging villages and towns and such, then taking the various spoils of war. This was actually not a terrible strategy to take. You soften up the territory with your raiders. You give free rein to take and burn and steal whatever they want. Then you move in with your larger force to occupy the area and live off its resources. It works pretty well. So slide 21 here, as the main part of the Muslim army moved northward, as we can see, up on an old Roman road towards the city of Tours, they ran across the main part of the Christian army, sitting and waiting directly in their way and blocking their path towards Tours. So from what we can tell, the Christian army was also blocking the only bridge across the Vienne River in that area that you could use to get to Tours, and the Abbey of St. Martin, which is kind of what they wanted. So with a large force sitting in his way, the only thing that Rahman could do was go through it. It was kind of like that camp song. I don't know if you ever went to a summer camp singing on a bus. Can't go over it, can't go around it, can't go under it, guess I'll have to go through. It's like going, I don't know, stupid, but still. It was that type of scenario where, okay, you have no way to get to your destination but to go through this guy. So that's kind of what he had to do. So here on slide 22, it is now that we come to the actual Battle of Tours. Charles Martel had done a very smart thing and taken the high ground. He had the high ground before Abdul-Rahman had a chance to pick and choose a battlefield that he wanted and would have fit his style. The larger army under Abdul-Rahman was mostly on horseback and very well armored, seemingly providing him the advantage. However, we will see that the greater advantage falls to the one who picks the rules for the game that is being played and the board it is being played on. By doing this, Charles Martel virtually neutralized whatever apparent advantage Abdul-Rahman held at the beginning of this conflict, and doing so, he was able to effectively turn what he thought was an advantage against him. Slide 23 here. Anyone who knows anything knows that while covering yourself in metal and sitting on a horse really works great while fighting out on an open, level field It's a really bad idea for fighting in trees and going up a hill. I guess you can kind of look at the conquistadors in South America. They cover themselves in metal and stuff. And in reality, most bow and arrows, they could actually go through that. It wasn't really good for in trees in a jungle climate. Anyway, just kind of a little similarity I found. Anyway, an open field enables you to put together an effective cavalry charge, which, is what the Muslims had been using all along to absolutely obliterate, I like that word, their enemies, and maintain that charge without the fear of running into anything. Trees and an incline do not do any favors for this method of warfare. It's rather prohibitive towards it. So slide 24 here. The Christian army under Charles Martel had a completely different strategy and forced their enemy to fight by their rules. The Christian army was mostly heavy infantry, so those are the guys that fight on foot without horses, and they had some light cavalry mixed in besides them. So Charles knew everything that I just told you in the last paragraph, and he knew how to use it to his advantage. His lightly armored, heavily clothed men were perfectly suited to fight in the trees, on a hill, in the cold. The army of Moors was ready for none of this. So moving on to slide 25 here. Charles Martel had chosen a fighting position perfectly suited for the upcoming battle. So from what we know, he had his forces on a hill covered with trees between the Vienne and Clain rivers. I hope I'm pronouncing Vienne right, maybe Vienne. Vienne, we'll stick with Vienne, that's good. So the trees were perhaps the deciding factor in this battle. Not only did they severely disadvantage the Muslim army, but they also helped to disguise the true number of men Charles had under his command. That was making Abdul-Rahman very wary to attack. But Abdul-Rahman had to attack. There was no way around it. So Rahman probably knew that there was absolutely no chance that Martel would come off of his hill. Why would he? It's a good position. So it almost turned into a short sort of siege, a very short siege, only lasted about a week, but it was sort of a siege. Just without a castle, a castle was a hill. So anyway, slide 26. The Muslim army, under Abdul-Rahman, had set up camp a bit off the base of the hill. And they decided just to wait there and try and observe the situation before making a move. This was a wise decision. Abdul-Rahman had no way of knowing how many men Charles had, and Charles had a good defensive position. So he was unlikely to make the first move. Charles was, he's not going to move first. Why would he? So the best thing Rahman could do was just to sit still and wait for the rest of his forces, to catch up with him and scout out the position of Charles Martel so that when he would have to attack, he might know what he was coming up against, and with more men, because, he took the time to wait for more to catch up. So for the next 7 days, the two armies, this is slide 27 now, next 7 days, the two armies poked and they prodded at each other in a way, just kind of. There were minor skirmishes with no real decisive winner, little fights breaking out here and sometimes there with no definitive winner to speak of, sort of like prodding each other, trying to figure out what they're made of and maybe weaknesses potentially. So the Christian army just sat up in the trees and held the good defensive ground. Charles knew that the ground he was sitting on was his only hope for anything resembling a victory when fighting the force he had to come up against. Abdul-Rahman probably knew that Charles knew this, so he really didn't want to mount an incursion up the hill and into the forest where the Christians had set up camp. Rahman, on the other hand, sat at the base of the hill and waited for the rest of his army to catch up still, which is a wise move. He was slow to attack. Rightly so, he had no idea how many troops were hiding in the trees on the hill, which, for all he knew, he was outnumbered. So as mentioned before, he waited on the ground where he was comfortable and prepared to attack when his numbers were higher. It's estimated by this time Rahman had gathered all of his forces about a week after his arrival at the battlefield near Tours and Poitiers. So his numbers were up to 25 to 30,000. Once again, as I've said before in one of the earlier slides, we really don't know how many men he had. We can guess, but we know it was substantially more than Charles. Probably about 10,000 men more. So slide 29 here. On the seventh day of waiting around, Abdul-Rahman decided his army simply could not wait any longer. So this was largely due in thanks to Mother Nature. Thanks to Mother Nature, who seems to be having a rather large effect on this particular battle with her hills and her trees and now her climate getting in the way. So the Muslim army had most of its experience fighting in the deserts of the south of Spain and North Africa. They had no experience or jackets to deal with the cold. Abdul Rahman knew that he had to attack before the snow started flying, or else, his men would literally freeze to death. And frostbite is not good for fighting. That's no good. So given the time of year, which is late October, it was beginning to get really cold. I think they're at a pretty similar latitude to us, maybe a little northern, actually. So it was getting cold. Cold is here in late October. That's about how cold it was getting there. So the Franks probably would have been fine fighting in the cold and possibly the snow. They were all dressed in furs and coats and all that stuff, and they were from that region, but the Muslims were not. Abdul Rahman, not wanting his army to freeze to death, decided that the time to attack was now or never. And so he attacked. Slide number 30. Abdul Rahman started off the attack in a fashion that he thought was fitting, given the Franks' obvious lack of cavalry. It was a cavalry charge, even though, there were trees and stuff. But much to his probable surprise and chagrin, the Franks were able to hold together and stave off the charge. This really came out of nowhere. Most of the time, a bunch of 2,000-pound animals with guys with big knives riding them, all covered in metal, were able to break through enemy lines. You have the psychological factor of a horse running towards you, and then just the physical factor of getting hit by something like that. That's got to hurt. But anyway, the troops under the command of Charles Martel, most of them were veterans. They'd seen some fighting before, had likely seen and experienced the tactic before, and they held firm. The Muslim forces did this again and again and again. They repeated it, and they couldn't break through. So Abdul Rahman ordered his cavalry to keep on charging, and eventually, and probably inevitably, a line of cavalry broke through the Christian line, as though they were hoping to reach the position of Charles Martel and maybe get him. Although Abdul Rahman probably didn't even know what Charles Martel looked like. Never seen him before. They're hoping to get to the center and then come around from behind, and once you get inside of somebody's lines, it's really over for that person. Unfortunately for the cavalry, however, the second line of infantry was waiting for them and quickly pushed them back to where they came from, all the way back down the hill. If they were fighting on the hill, which they probably were. Had this cavalry broken through, the Arab forces surely would have won the day. Slide 32. As the battle raged on, the Duke of Odo, who I feel I have to mention was about 80 at this time, he's an old dude, was ordered to take some light cavalry behind the enemy lines and wreak havoc on the lightly guarded enemy encampment. So over the course of their conquest, as we talked about, the Muslims had taken many slaves, women, lots of gold, hauled off really anything they were able to carry with them and that they wanted to take. Remember, that was their style of doing things and their method of conquering. So what did the Duke of Odo do to actually tick off the attacking forces? He freed slaves, burned stuff, took gold, and just made an all-around mess of the place in an attempt to distract the opposing army from the battle at hand. Personally, I find this a little bit ironic, like the Muslim army got to feel like what it was like to be looted for once. But maybe that's just me. Slide 33. This action had a large psychological effect on the fighting Arab troops, as they saw all of their loot and booty being burned and taken. So many of them rushed away from the battle to save what they could of their own ill-gotten gains. As they ran, unfortunately for them, Charles had his troops charge from behind and absolutely slaughter the running and disorganized men who were far more focused on saving their spoils of war than they were of actually winning the battle now. It's kind of like, oh crap, everything we worked for, everything we took, it's being burned, so we're going to focus on that now. Abdul Rahman, he tried desperately to push his forces back towards the front, but he had very little success. They were frenzied, they were panicked, they wanted to get back to their camp. Once the move backward had started, it was futile trying to get to turn around again. Abdul got caught up in the falling tide of the fighting, and when the dead were counted and piled up, among them was Abdul Rahman. So slide 34 here. The Christians only pursued the Arabs for so long, however. As you probably guessed, it would be unwise to overstretch forces and fall into an ambush. Because, I mean, when you overstretch force, you become more vulnerable, and a retreating force could easily take advantage of that. We do not know if the Muslim forces were planning on ambushing the Christian army if it did overextend, but it was wise for them not to overextend all the same. Instead, the Christian army counted up their losses, licked their wounds, probably did some first aid and stuff of that sort, and retreated back into the forest from which they had come. They fully expected the Arabs to make another charge the next day, but no charge came. Apparently, the defeat they suffered was such that they decided to get the heck out of Dodge and not come back. Slide 35. The Arabs retreated from the Battle of Tours back below the Pyrenees Mountains. So the Pyrenees Mountains, just for some context, it's a mountain range that stretches from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea on the east to the Bay of Biscay on the Atlantic Ocean on the west. These mountains serve as a pretty clear dividing line between northern Spain and southern France. Eventually, far down line 1609, all Muslims in Spain would be expelled by some order that a king declared. Honestly, it's another topic, once again, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Slide 36. Though this victory did not play an extremely large role in the end of Muslim advance into Europe, well, yeah, I guess it played a large role, but it wasn't the definitive factor. There were some things happening behind the scenes that contributed to this. Do you know those Berbers I mentioned in one of the earlier slides? Yes, they revolted against the Muslims in the year 739, so it's like just a couple years, like 7 years down the road. That put some pretty big cracks in the Muslim military strength and prominence in that region, because they no longer had this huge force that was native to the area working with them. So anyway, there was some stuff happening backstage as well, but that is mostly unrelated and would also be off topic for this video. The point is that a combination of military defeat and backroom dissension leads to the loss of military prominence for Muslims all throughout Gaul and that region. Slide 37. For Charles Martel, the victory at Tours led to many great things, at least temporarily. According to Britannica, which is basically fancy Wikipedia for smart people, for his part, Charles derived profit as well as glory from his victory. He was at least able to assert his authority in Aquitaine, where, having forced Eudes to swear allegiance to him, Eudes is, by the way, that's Odo, same guy, allegiance to him, he allowed Eudes to continue to rule as duke. Even this victory was short-lived, however. When Eudes died in 735, he was succeeded by his son Hunald, and the new duke immediately began asserting his independence. Charles was compelled to march on Bordeaux in a show of force that only temporarily cowed the region. Aquitaine would not be fully subdued until Charles's grandson Charlemagne brought it under Frankish rule in 781. You may notice I read that in a British accent because, it's Britannica. Why not? So while the victory at Tours did calm things down temporarily, it was by no means the end of the struggle for Charles Martel or the Franks and Gauls as a whole people. Slide 38. As it turns out, the Muslims actually had enough. After the Battle of Tours, numerous other incursions would occur. None of them would be successful. Only a few years after the defeat at Tours, Muslim forces would attempt an invasion into Aquitaine. And the Muslim forces would take Dauphine, Burgundy, Vienne, Valence, Lyon, and several other prominent cities and territories besides. During this time, Charles Martel was busy fighting elsewhere, so he had to have his half-brother do the job. The half-brother did his job well and successfully pushed the Muslims back down south again. Again in 739, Muslim forces would attempt to invade Gaul. This invasion was also unsuccessful, as you probably would have guessed. In the year 741, Charles would die, and the struggle between nations would continue long after his death. It would continue to be an ongoing fight, even for his grandson Charlemagne, a good 60 years down the line. In the bigger picture, the Battle of Tours affected all of religious European and world history. Had the Christians not won the Battle of Tours, the Muslim advance would have continued northward into and throughout Europe. The Catholic Church and all existing forms of government would have toppled, and Sharia law probably would have been instated. The Islamic European Empire would have discovered the New World, probably formed the Islamic American colonies, or something to that effect. I really don't know. It never happened. And proceeded to grow in size and power from there, probably to conquering the world. Had the tides of this one battle swung differently, all of world history would have been permanently and irrevocably affected. Charles Martel is probably the reason you're listening to me speak English right now, so I hope you appreciate that. I also hope you enjoyed listening to this lecture. I personally really enjoyed talking about it, and I think the Battle of Tours, it really represents one of those moments in history where it all could have changed. And I like those moments. Just kind of makes you appreciate what we have now. Anyway, I hope you have a good day, afternoon, evening, or whenever you're watching this. This is Clyde Kelly, signing out. Oh, one last thing. Here's a picture of Zach Galifianakis and Charles Martel. Are they the same person? You tell me. I do not know. Perhaps Zach is immortal. I don't know. Just that the similarities are uncanny. And my second question, if you were paying attention, how many pairs of googly eyes did you see on numerous historical figures? If you don't know, go back and look. Try to find out. And that'd be it now. Bye-bye now. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.